Okay, we are moving on, sort of, to the subject of the American Revolution and the conception of an American national identity. So, we're still in the 1700s. The last unit talked quite a bit about what was going on during the 1700s, but all of this is also happening during the 1700s, and so it's important to kind of reinforce some of the concepts of what the social hierarchy was at that time leading up to the revolution and also what followed. So, of course, men are considered superior over women in all things and in all avenues, legally, socially, religiously, in all ways. Whites are considered superior to non-whites, so anyone who is black or Native American. Notice I didn't use the phrase African American there, but that's because that phrase didn't exist yet. Honestly, neither did Native American at that time, so they would not have been referred to in those ways. There was also a dominant class of wealthy elites and landowners, so really not that different from the Europe that was left behind in that regard. And some big differences, though, that were happening were in literacy and education. So for the first half of the 1700s, reading and writing was really considered an elitist pastime. Most people were so busy just trying to scratch out a living in terms of farming and other industry that they just would not have had any time to read, and it would not have been anything useful for them. They wouldn't have, I mean, they would have known some basics to allow them to perhaps read the Bible or, conduct business transactions, but beyond that, reading and writing for reading and writing's sake was considered, yes, highly elitist. At that time, almost all blacks, half of white women, and a fifth of white men were illiterate. So for that reason, most literature, as we know it, would have been transmitted through oral culture. This continued to be particularly true for slaves because they were actually legally banned from learning to read and write, and that's something that's going to come up in Frederick Douglass's autobiography, including the story of how he did learn how to read and write. A little bit more on literacy and education. For the second half of the 1700s, literacy became much more commonplace, and a lot of that had to do with the invention of the printing press, making it easy to not only create a text, but to make many, many, many copies of that text, like an unlimited number, very quickly and cheaply and easily, instead of having to write everything out painstakingly by hand. So now it became really easy to just distribute text, literature, to people on a mass scale, and that of course is going to lead to greater literacy rates because you can't really learn how to read if you don't have anything to read. So literacy then became associated with a sort of more like cosmopolitan city life status, and it was seen as a real sign of individual accomplishment if you were a good reader and writer. And at this time we start getting universities on American soil, what would become America. So the earliest ones, you probably recognize the names: Harvard, Princeton, Yale. Notice these are all in the Northeast. Okay, how are things going for minorities at that time? Well, you can probably guess, and of course from reading Samson Occam's diaries, autobiography, you know that the answer is not great. Now for women, education was definitely becoming more accessible. These things called dame schools started opening up where women would learn how to read and write, primarily so they could teach their children, but they'd also learn other things like how to maintain their household, sewing, handicrafts, things like that. So kind of a practical / academic combination for a school. And really only as much literacy as was deemed necessary for her to be able to perform her duties as a wife and mother. Okay, there were also what were known as Indian education experiments. So this is something that comes up in, of course, Samson Occam's narratives. The idea being that there were groups of people who thought, hey, we should try and acculturate the natives by opening these schools and basically taking their children and putting them in these schools so they can learn Christianity, Christian values. They can learn to read and write in English. They can learn how to dress and act like English people do. So, literacy was still, of course, banned or unavailable for most slaves at the time, with pretty stiff punishments, including corporal punishment, capital punishment. Okay, so one of your assigned readings was from John de Crèvecoeur, Letters from an American Farmer. The reason this text is important and why it was assigned is that Crèvecoeur was really the first to ask, through literature, what is an American anyway? And what does it mean to be an American? So that's a question that y'all grappled with on the introductory discussion board assignment, but he's doing it sort of at the inception of an American identity. And so he spends a lot of time talking about what it means to be an American and, you know, just how it differs so much from European lifestyles and values, putting obviously the American way as the superior way. He was actually French. He was not American, hence the name Jean de Crèvecoeur. But he traveled all over the colonies extensively for conducting trade and doing geographical surveys. So he got a really good lay of the land, better than most people would have had at that time. So people really enjoyed reading from his perspective. It's as much as it reads like an autobiography or diary, it's not. It's spoken, it's narrated through the voice of a fictional character, a Quaker farmer named James. So just bear that in mind. John de Crèvecoeur was not a farmer, and he was not a Quaker, and he didn't actually experience any of those things. It is Letters from an American Farmer is fictional. He was not an American farmer. I just want to make that totally clear. But it was a pretty convincing narrative, and it did a lot to, I guess, crystallize or cement the different ideas and values that were starting to create the picture of an American identity. So, yeah, exactly. So he uses this character to convey the attitudes and experiences of the newly developing American society, what was going on during that time, including leading up to revolution. And just take note of how James the farmer talks about the position he's put in as revolution is being fomented, because he's really being torn in two directions. He doesn't really have any vested interest on either side, and so, but he has to pick a side, and if he picks the wrong one and that side loses, then his life as he knows it will be completely destroyed. And so, and his family is a constant threat, really, by the chaos being incited by both sides of the revolution. So it provides a really interesting kind of man-in-the-middle perspective that you don't often see, because obviously history is written by the victors, so it's all going to be very pro-revolution. But this just gives us a good sense of like how most people were feeling at the time when they were forced to choose a side. And in the end, well, you'll see what choice he makes and what he ends up deciding to do. So make sure you read all the way through to the end. I might ask you about it on a test. I don't know. Just saying. Oop, and I'm stuck. Something else to keep an eye on as you're reading Crèvecoeur's narrative is his views on slavery. There's some pretty graphic depictions of how slaves are treated in his narrative, and one of the things that I would have had y'all talking about in a face-to-face class, and that you may be called on to talk about later, are ways that John Woolman and Crèvecoeur are similar in their views on slavery, but also there's some key differences as well. So, for instance, like Farmer James, you know, our American farmer, he does have slaves himself. And so pay special attention to how he ends up treating them at the end of the narrative. It's a complicated end for them, for sure. Definitely raises some eyebrows. So, all right, let's move on to Benjamin Franklin. I'm sure you've heard of Benjamin Franklin before. I just wanted to start with a little fun fact about him. He was not trusted to take part in writing the Declaration of Independence, even though he was an exceptionally good writer and well-respected writer, because the other, founding fathers, so to speak, were afraid that he would put a joke in it, and he agreed. He said, "Oh yeah, I absolutely would have." So Yeah, could have been a very different history for us if he'd been given that responsibility. So it went to Thomas Jefferson instead. A little bit more serious. But Benjamin Franklin is still, he was never president, but he was still an incredibly central, pivotal figure in forming the American identity and revolution. So he was a statesman and a true Renaissance man, meaning that this guy could do just about anything, and he would tell you all about it, as you know from reading his autobiography. He was a scientist. He had many different inventions that he created. He was a philosopher, a politician, a published author, very well-read author, very popular for that. So he did it all, and he talks in his autobiography quite a bit about all of his accomplishments, but also he gives this sort of instructional guide almost for how he manages his time in order to be able to do so many different things. Of course, it helps when you've got a wife and sister who are doing all your cooking and cleaning and housekeeping for you. Had to get that in there. It also helps when you only sleep 3 hours a night, as you'll see he claims to do. Because you can sleep when you're dead, right? There's just too much to be done. There's that American industry and thrift. So he was known for openness to new ideas. He changed his stance on a lot of very important political issues over the course of his life, one of which being slavery, which is impressive because most people just dig in and double down on whatever their beliefs are, and he was always open to re-examining them. And was very open about that. He had a natural curiosity about people, about places, about things around him, how the world worked, and so that was a huge part of who he was. An incredibly strong work ethic, as he'll tell you about in his autobiography. It was work, work, work all the time. No time for leisure. That actually, really, the truth is that he was, especially when he went over to Europe to do some negotiating on the part of the newly formed America, he was quite the ladies' man. He was married, but he was quite the ladies' man and quite the partier. So, yeah, he worked hard and he played hard. So, take it with a grain of salt. And he just loved talking to people. He loved having conversations, and all of these things led to really tremendous success in several areas of his life, which, again, he will tell you all about in his autobiography. He was also a deist. A lot of the founding fathers were, which is basically a deist. Their take on religion is they believed in God. They weren't atheists, but they looked at God more as a supreme architect, or they would frequently call him the watchmaker, who did not interfere with his creation. Basically, they said, all right, God created the universe as we know it. He set the wheels in motion, wound the watch. He made the watch and wound the watch. But then after that, he stepped away, and everything that's happened since then has been not due to his interference, but just a kind of natural unfolding of events, right? So that was a pretty radical take on things, and like I said, most of the founding fathers were deist. So keep that in mind going forward. He believed very strongly that self-reliance, relying on oneself and constantly improving oneself as an individual would, if we all did that, then that would lead to an improved society. So he's definitely trying to, in imparting, his autobiography on the world, is trying to show, all right, this is how I was successful. You can be successful too. He's kind of like the first Tony Robbins, I guess, in a way. Kind of self-help guy. He's like, just get out there and believe in yourself and work hard and always be striving for better. And if we all do that, well, it'll lead to a better society all around. So very American, what we know now as American values. Self-reliance, individualism for the greater good. Okay, take a little pause right there.